We're so glad you're here. This is our annual gathering for the Castañeda Jennings Award and Lecture, and I'm glad to celebrate with you. I was thinking first of memories. As far as I know, and I think this is about right, CTS has been gathering in this way since about 1994, so about 30 years. And we are grateful for those times and those various lectures we've had and all that sort of thing. Starting first as a potluck, just to celebrate queer presence at CTS, and then turning into a lecture series, which we've continued. And we're very glad to continue this year with Dr. Strassfeld, who you will hear from in a little bit. Then I was thinking next of the balance between this gathering as an academic exercise, learning something new that's useful in terms of both theory and practice in relation to the inclusion of LGBTQIA+ folks in the life of society and the world, and we'll certainly be thinking about that today. But also that it's an occasion of bonds of love. First, Gilberto Castañeda and God. He was a lover of God who lived and died among us back then, 30 years ago. The bonds of love of Rana and Ted and Gilberto, and their ever-changing, ever-evolving queer family. And of course, Ted's love of learning and teaching, and those he attracted to come with us to CTS to study, especially in terms of queer religious studies, but of all sorts of things in the relationship to theology, ethics, and especially sexual ethics. All these things I think of, and I think I'd ask you to keep in mind as we gather again this year, as we will continue to gather in the future as well. And teach together, learn together, and love. That's what I hope. And with that, I will turn to our president. We're very honored to have Dr. Brad Braxton with us this evening, and he has a few words of welcome for us. So, Dr. Braxton.
Thank you, Dr. Haldeman. Greetings, CTS family. I am Brad Braxton, President and Professor of Public Theology at CTS. And on behalf of our esteemed Board of Trustees and every member of the CTS family, I extend a warm welcome to the 2025 Castañeda Jennings Lecture. In a climate where mean-spirited politics and reactionary forms of religion too often dehumanize LGBTQ+ siblings who equally bear the divine image, we are called to be audacious. Now more than ever, we must creatively foster forms of community and prophetic scholarship that enlarge our understanding of family and enrich our practices of progressive politics and transgressive love. At the Open Church, where I serve as founding senior pastor, we recently reflected on what it means for progressive communities such as CTS, deeply invested in prophetic justice, to be traitors to treacherous tyranny, sometimes subversively working in the shadows, and sometimes brazenly disrupting hate that is masquerading as holiness, so that the kingdom might come on earth as it is in heaven. This evening, we gather as fellow traitors to treachery, celebrating a legacy forged in radical hospitality and an unwavering commitment to justice. This lecture honors Professor Ted Jennings, a theologian who tirelessly championed God's justice and mercy, especially for those at society's margins. His wife, CTS alumna, Reverend Rana Case, who joins us this evening, and their adopted son, Gilberto. The Castañeda Jennings Scholarship continues this vital work, supporting students who embody the vision of LGBTQ plus moral and civic equality and who courageously promote queer religious studies. We are profoundly honored this evening to learn from and with Dr. Max Strassfeld, who will lead us onward in our work of bold emancipation of the religious imagination and brave societal transformation, so that in this world there might be more justice, mercy, and radically inclusive love. I now invite Mr. Chad Swickerath, our Vice President for Advancement and Strategic Initiatives, to talk with us further about the Castañeda Jennings legacy.
Thank you so much, President Braxton. What always excites me about lectures like this is that I can look around the room and I can see familiar faces. Hello to you all. To those I'm seeing for the first time, as President Braxton said, my name is Chad Swickerath, and I'm the Vice President for Advancement and Strategic Initiatives here at CTS. Tonight's Castañeda Jennings Lecture and Award started with a group of people, we heard from Scott, at a small potluck. It started with a group of people and a simple idea that queer and trans folk matter, that LGBTQ people and their families have a place in our congregations and our communities. And CTS continues to work to embody this commitment. For 170 years now, and let me say that again, for 170 years, Chicago Theological Seminary has pushed the boundaries of theological education. Ours is an ongoing legacy of progressive firsts and historic social justice. Today, our mission is to create greater justice in our society and our world, collaborating with new communities, establishing fresh areas of study, and opening our minds to different ways of thinking. We live into our beliefs more sincerely when we do this. And it all happens at things like tonight, at lectures like tonight. And so I invite you to join me in celebrating Castañeda Jennings Lecture and celebrating CTS's 170th anniversary. Join me in supporting theological education with a gift in the link at the side of your program, or maybe it's at the bottom. And I invite you to save the date for October 9th for something special. As we celebrate the 170th anniversary at our C. Shelby Rooks Lecture. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Barrett, and I use the pronouns she, her. I am a Jewish lesbian, and my wife and I live in Scottsdale, Arizona. Why are you hearing from me? Well, I had the honor of receiving the 2024 Jennings Castañeda Award. So I just wanted to let you know that as receiving this award and knowing that this award reflects and honors openly gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer students at CTS is why I chose CTS. With the commitment to support the LGBTQ plus community, this is transforming religious spaces from places of hostility and alienation to communities of hospitality and empowerment. And that is what I am learning in CTS. Honoring Dr. Jennings and Gilberto Castañeda has been a privilege. Learning with you and from you has been a key aspect of studies at CTS. I chose CTS because it recognizes so many ideologies and especially acknowledges and supports the theological work of LGBTQ plus community. CTS has given me the space to live out loud and be proud as a lesbian Jewish woman living in this world today. I just want to close with taking a second for ourselves to find ourselves centered as we learn and we hear from each other. I'd like us just to take a breath in and out as we center ourselves in love. And as we center ourselves in love, I want to offer a prayer of peace. Adon HaShalom, Melech HaShalom, grant shalom to all people of the world. Let shalom spread to you, your creatures. Let there be an end to hatred, jealousy, and violence. Let there be great love and shalom between us all, so that each person may sit under his vine and under her fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. And let us say, Amen. So it be. Thanks so much.
Amen. Thank you, Deb. That was beautiful. Good evening. I am Emily Vogt. I'm the Academic Dean at CTS, and I'm presenting the winner of this year's Castañeda Jennings Award. The Castañeda Jennings Fund provides a $1,500 cash award either to openly gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered students, or to those who actively support the openly gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered student community at CTS. The award reflects the seminary's commitment on behalf of these students to transform religious spaces from places of hostility and alienation to communities of hospitality and empowerment, as Deb alluded to a moment ago. Tonight, we honor Elle Dowd, a student who demonstrates this commitment to transforming places of worship and the public square toward the full inclusion of the LGBTQ community. Elle Dowd, she, they pronouns, is a bisexual pastor, author, activist, and PhD student at CTS, where their research focuses on the revolutionary potential of an anti-capitalist bisexual theology. They are ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and bring a fierce commitment to the work of collective liberation across academic, ecclesial, and community spaces. Elle's life and theology are shaped by their deep ties to Sierra Leone, where their 2 children were born, and to St. Louis, where they were transformed by the radical, queer, Black leadership of the Ferguson Uprising. Their first book, Baptized in Tear Gas, From White Moderate to Abolitionist, chronicles their journey into abolitionist practice and public witness. A co-conspirator with movements such as #DecolonizeLutheranism, Elle has served on the board of the Eurodescent Lutheran Association for Racial Justice, the Clergy Advocacy Board for Planned Parenthood, and currently organizes locally as a board member of SOUL, Southsiders Organized for Unity and Liberation. They regularly facilitate workshops in both Christian and secular spaces on topics such as embodied spirituality, anti-racism, queer theology, and faith-based community organizing. In receiving this award, Elle recommits themselves to costly solidarity rooted in queer resistance, abolitionist imagination, and the enduring belief that another world is not only possible, but already unfolding. Congratulations, Elle Dowd. And Elle, I'll turn it over to you to say a little word.
Thank you so much. I received this award with deep gratitude and trembling reverence for the legacy of Dr. Theodore Jennings and Gilberto Castañeda, and for the spirit who continues to breathe life into the struggle for liberation. Dr. Jennings' book, The Man Jesus Loved, cracked open a holy possibility for me that the body of Jesus, in my tradition, God enfleshed, could bear not only wounds, but desire. that queerness is not alien to Christ, but rooted in him, that we do not have to choose between our belovedness and our truths, and that the scandal of the gospel is not respectability, but intimacy. Intimacy with the outcasts, with the lover, with those in chains, con la gente indocumentada. I'm thinking of Gilberto Castañeda, an undocumented lay minister who served his community with the kind of courage that cannot be taught. He was killed by the malicious negligence of past administrations who abandoned people living with AIDS. He died from AIDS-related complications, and he was so much more than that. He was a beloved child of God, a minister, and a martyr of the state's cruelty. That same cruelty continues today as this current administration kidnaps children in raids, cages loved ones in death boxes at our borders, disappears people into concentration camps, tears families apart in the name of law and order. The world calls that security, but the gospel calls it sin. These atrocities are not just policy failures, they're theological failures. Every deportation is a desecration of the image of God. Every ICE raid is a crucifixion, and every time we remain silent, we are complicit. But resurrection is real, and resurrection breaks into our world by tearing down all that keeps us divided: borders, concentration camps, secret police, every system that says to a beloved child of God, you don't belong. People of faith and all people of goodwill must rise up, not just in word, but in deed, by becoming the kinship networks that empire tries to sever. As I receive this award, I carry with me my queer ancestors and my undocumented siblings. I carry my children, immigrants born in Sierra Leone. And I carry the Black, brown, trans, disabled, and poor saints who teach me what divine resistance looks like. To the Chicago Theological Seminary, and especially to you, Rev Rana, I say thank you. And to everyone listening, I say, we need you. You were made for this moment. The spirit of the divine who dwelled in Gilberta Castañeda and Ted Jennings is upon us. She has anointed us to bring good news to the poor, to set the captives free, to tear down every wall that divides. In honor of their powerful memory, let's get to work. Thank you. Y chinga la migra.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Elle, for those words, which were very much in the spirit of Professor Ted Jennings. My name is Ken Stone, and I am Professor of Bible Culture and Hermeneutics here at Chicago Theological Seminary, where I do also teach courses in LGBTQ religious studies, among other topics. And it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce this year's Castañeda Jennings speaker. Dr. Max Strassfeld is currently Associate Professor with tenure at University of Southern California and previously served as Associate Professor with tenure at University of Arizona. After earning a BA in Comparative Literature with a focus on Hebrew literature at Brown University, they went on to earn a PhD in Religious Studies at Stanford University. Dr. Strassfeld is the author of a real path-breaking book titled Trans Talmud, Androgynes and Eunuchs in Rabbinic Literature, which was published by the University of California Press in 2022. Trans Talmud won an award for excellence in textual studies from the American Academy of Religion in 2023, and it was also a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. So it has received a lot of positive attention, as indeed it should. Dr. Strassfeld's other publications include a chapter titled Androgynes, Hybrid Animals, and the Project of Trans History, which has just appeared in a brand new edited volume of essays titled Trans-Biblical, New Approaches to Interpretation and Embodiment in Scripture, published by Westminster John Knox Press. And among their other current activities, Dr. Strassfeld is an associate editor for QTR, a journal of trans and queer religion, which I encourage you to look for if you have not already. Tonight, Dr. Strassfeld will be speaking to us on the very timely topic, Transing the Talmud in a Time of Crisis. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Max Strassfeld.
For the lovely introduction and for sharing your words. Also, all of you, I have been moved. And also just thank you for your work in the world. It's all so important right now. I am honored to be included in the Castañeda lectures. There is a long list of amazing speakers that have preceded me in this series. The definition of a tough act to follow. So let me just make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Apologies. Okay, great. So I am going to be talking for about 30 minutes, which should leave us time for questions and discussion. And what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about eunuchs and androgynes and my research on the topic. Then I want to start a conversation, and really just the beginning of a conversation about the project of trans history in the current political environment. And that latter part of the talk is offered in a vein of an invitation. These are thoughts that I'm still struggling to put into words, and my reaction to a political landscape that has changed so very much even from when the book came out, which is not so long ago. I want to begin by briefly situating us in time and space for those that are unfamiliar with rabbinic literature. I'll introduce the categories I study and how I study them. Don't feel anxious about holding on to all the details of it. There will not be a quiz. And mostly what I want you to pay attention to is the kind of breadth of the kinds of people and bodies we're talking about today. Okay, so first of all, what is rabbinic literature? What is the Talmud? Rabbinic literature originates in approximately-ish the first 6 centuries of the Common Era. It's a body of literature that's the product of a movement called the Rabbinic Movement, which is spread between Roman Palestine in the west and the Sasanian Empire in the east. And I'm oversimplifying, but that's broadly the when and where we are in time. The Talmud is the most famous composition to come out of that body of literature, but it's not a genre that we're familiar with. It contains what's called halakha, which is often translated as legal sources. Law is a very imperfect translation. It also contains stories about the rabbis, medical advice, ritual prohibitions, biblical interpretations. So it's not a kind of text that we are familiar with. We'll be looking today at an earlier layer of the text that's going to set up some of the conversations that occur in the Talmud. I also want to introduce you to the figures that I'm referring to as eunuchs and androgynes in English. And again, You don't need to hold on to all the different terms. I want you to notice the breadth of what the rabbis mean by those terms that don't translate so easily into English. The rabbis inherit the category of eunuch and their word for it, saris, from the Hebrew Bible. Although there's a debate about how often in the Bible the word saris means eunuch, feel free to nerd out with me in the Q&A later if you're interested in that debate. Although they inherit the word, the rabbis elaborate on the category itself. So they distinguish between types of eunuchs. There is a kind of eunuch for the rabbis that means something similar to what we mean when we use that word in English. This is a man who becomes a eunuch by making changes to their body or their genitalia, or having changes made to their body. So the rabbis don't specify whether this is volitional or not, which is something we can talk about more. It's a tension in the category, right? There are also for the rabbis, however, both men and women who are born with different bodies. That mean they're never going to reproduce or procreate. The rabbis also consider those born eunuchs as eunuchs. Today, we might call those folks intersex people. Those of you who are familiar with the Christian Bible might think about Matthew 19:12, right? We're seeing a pretty similar taxonomy here, not exactly the same. I'm sure those of you familiar with the verse will spot the difference, but there's a kind of similar breakdown, those who are born eunuchs and those who become, right? So what I want us to know is, first of all, is that what the rabbis conceptualize as eunuchs, the saris and the ailonit, is more expansive than what we tend to mean when we use that term in English. There are also figures that I call androgynes in English. Androgynos is clearly a loan word from the Greek. And I included on the slide a picture of a popular statue of a figure called Sleeping Hermaphroditus. That's some of the evidence. There's a lot of evidence that the Romans were engaging in categories of eunuchs and androgynes quite extensively as well. So the rabbis have their particular discussions of the topic, but they're part of a broad conversation that's happening in late antiquity. We will see a rabbinic source that is the closest we have to a description of the androgyne shortly, from which scholars surmise that the androgynos is best described as someone with two sets of genitalia. They're never explicitly defined. The text is remarkably uninterested in diagnosing them. The other person I'm calling an androgyne is the tumtum. There's really no equivalent in English. The tumtum is also described differently in different places. Their defining feature is that their sex gender is unknown, right? It's possible it might be revealed, but in the present moment, it is unknown. So when I talk about eunuchs and androgynes in rabbinic literature, this is really shorthand in English for a number of different categories that don't really translate that well. I also want us to notice that none of these categories map particularly well onto contemporary categories like intersex or transgender. The term intersex, for example, is a kind of umbrella term, right? It's a term that assumes that many different kinds of bodily and sexed variations are connected in some way and can be grouped under an umbrella term. The rabbinic term, saris, is also a kind of an umbrella term. It contains different types of eunuchs, but notice that the rabbinic eunuch can be born with sex variation, something we might tend to associate more with intersex today, or they can be a person who makes changes to their body. And both of those people would be called a eunuch by the rabbis, neither of which maps easily, right, onto trans or intersex. So the rabbis had different ways of understanding and organizing bodies and different taxonomies of sex and gender. Instead of identifying historical trans figures then, I talk about transing in my work. So I want to tell you briefly what I mean about transing. First of all, I don't make up this term. It's invented by Joanne Meyerowitz. She gives a talk, and then Susan Stryker, Paisley Carrat, and Lisa Jean Moore elaborate on it in a 2008 issue of Women's Studies Quarterly, and they're using transing as a verb. They're playing with that prefix trans. Okay, so I'll just read this passage aloud, and then I'll break it down for you, so don't worry about holding all the details. Transing is a practice that assembles gender into contingent structures of association with other aspects of bodily being, and that allows for reassembly. Transing can function as a disciplinary tool when the stigma associated with lack or loss of gender status threatens social intelligibility. It can also function as an escape vector, a line of flight, or a pathway towards liberation. Notice in their definition that they're emphasizing the way different aspects of bodies are combined to create meaning, and that these are contingent. In other words, there's no stable ahistorical body that exists through time, but rather that various qualities in our bodies can be assembled and reassembled to make meaning in different times, places, and contexts. Notice also, transing can mean two opposite things. It can be talking about a disciplinary tool used to regulate bodies. It can also describe a path towards liberation. We'll be talking more today about disciplinary effects. I think I'm really feeling the weight of the political context in which I write. But I want us to hold on to the possibility also that transing can mean a path towards liberation. So I'll get to some of that tension maybe at the end. We'll have a little time for that. So what do I mean when I'm talking about transing to describe disciplinary effects? Transing helps me think about how certain bodies are made to carry the weight of certain kinds of body failures. I'll give you an example, a couple of examples. Lots of bodies will experience shifts in their hormones throughout their lifetimes. Lots of different people may even take some kind of supplementary hormones. Only some of these hormonal treatments are labeled a sex change, quote unquote, and regulated differently in medicine. Another example, anyone who has struggled to have a child can tell you that reproduction, even when you have all the necessary bits you need, is never guaranteed. Jewish texts have talked quite a bit about infertility. So when we get to the rabbis who are defining eunuchs by the fact that they cannot reproduce, I step back to ask a sort of deliberately naive question. If everyone can fail to reproduce, and in the Hebrew Bible and in other texts, if everyone can be born with a body that might fail to reproduce, what is it that makes the procreative failures of eunuchs pathological exactly, right? Why are they of a different caliber? In other words, whose bodies are made to carry the weight of particular failures? And asking those naive questions, even when I can sometimes give you formal answers, legal reasoning, why they're separating out certain phenomenon, it also can be quite helpful to point out the logics underlying these sources. So I want to look quickly. In the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to take us totally through this text. That essay that Dr. Stone mentioned has some more analysis of this text, but this is the most programmatic text on the androgyne. It comes from an earlier layer of rabbinic literature than the Talmud, and we see that it is being used to raise some pretty fundamental questions about androgyne and their relationship to Jewish law. The beginning of the text starts, in the case of the androgyne, There are ways that he is equivalent to men. There are ways that he is equivalent to women. There are ways that he is equivalent to both men and women, and there are ways that he is not equivalent to either men or women. And the rest of the text is going to be organized under these 4 headings. How is the androgyne like men? How is the androgyne like women, etc., demonstrating how androgynes can function within halakha, within the legal system, in all these 4 ways. I just want to note the translation of this simple sentence is difficult because of the androcentrism of Hebrew. The grammar is in the masculine, which is why I translated it as he. I've struggled with the translation through the years. I have translations earlier using pronouns like sie and here. You're sort of left with the unappetizing proposition of either ignoring the androcentrism of the language or shutting down the question they're trying to ask before they can even ask it. So I also wanted to just point to, gesture at the constraints of language, even in translating that sentence. In the interest of time, I'm not going to take you through each different section of the list, which is fascinating and has a lot to teach us also about rabbinic androcentrism and halakha, amongst other things. But I want us to notice that this is a prosaic discussion over the status of the androgyne in relation to specific laws. What does the androgyne do in this case and that case? But at the same time, it's also raising some deeper questions. For the rabbis in general, having more obligations is positive. We're not in a rights-based legal system in rabbinic literature. So when the rabbis compare the androgyne to men and women, say, here's how they can function as a man or a woman, they're demonstrating the ways in which the androgyne is obligated and therefore can be incorporated into rabbinic law, right? So this is a move to include androgynes. There are practical difficulties if you actually tried to live out these obligations. So according to the laws of yichud, of seclusion, for example, the androgyne is not permitted to be alone with either men or women they're not married to or related to. So how would that practically work, right? But the approach, at least, the drive of it, is to try and weave the androgyne into the legal and the social fabric. So they talk also about marriage and the androgyne. If the strategy of this list, this 4-category list, is to try and incorporate the androgyne, the coda to the text takes a different approach. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. The androgyne is unique, and the sages could not decide about him whether he is a man or she is a woman, and the gender there changes. So I'm also translating literally in that section. So Rabbi Yossi is disagreeing with the approach that came before. He assumes that to participate in the law, the sages would have had to designate the androgyne as either a man or a woman. Because they don't assign a legal gender for Rabbi Yossi, the implication is they can't be included. The final statement by Rabbi Yossi undoes the work of carefully fitting the androgyne into gendered laws. It's, on one level, an extraordinary statement. If you want your legal system to look comprehensive, like we can address all the things in our surroundings, it's sacrificing that illusion in order to make this statement about the androgyne. So on the one level, the list and the coda diametrically opposed. One is a move to include, one is a move to exclude. In my larger argument, I spend time thinking about the ways that both the list and the coda are actually positioning gender as central to the rabbinic project. And therefore, these two strategies, even though they seem opposed, are actually, in a sense, colluding with one another. But for a moment, I just want us to focus on the coda and the language of the coda. From a contemporary Jewish trans perspective, Jewish intersex perspective, there are all sorts of problems with this source. And trans, queer, and intersex Jews have been drawn to this text, particularly that last line that describes the androgyne as a unique being that is neither male nor female. In the face of cultures that can deny our existence, this text is treating the presence of androgynes prosaically as existing in the world. I think we can actually, however, go farther than that. I believe the androgynes understood, the rabbis understood androgynes, to have been created by God. So the phrase I'm translating there as they're unique would be more literally translated something like the androgyne is a creation unto themselves. And that word creation, bria, comes from the same root as the first verb in the first verse of Genesis when God creates the world. I believe that this verb creation is meant as a citation here and would have brought for the folks listening to it in these time period the associations of being created by God. I think it is also, this I can't prove exactly, but I think it means that these stories that we have later on about creation are actually quite early. So I think it's an oblique reference to rabbinic texts that interpret that creation story in Genesis. And these rabbinic traditions read the Genesis 1:27, the verse that says male and female God created them, as meaning that the first human created by God was an androgyne. In other words, androgynes are not just part of the order of creation, they are the first human in the world. And I think this is carrying the flavor of that. This is demonstrating that that story, that the first human, Adam, is an androgyne, is in fact quite old in the rabbinic tradition. We'll come back to the verse and Genesis in a minute, but I want to talk for a minute about some of the contemporary debate over sex and gender in law and examine a very different reception history of Genesis. I think it's, when I used to talk about this text, I would spend a fair bit of time outlining, here's what's happening to trans people in the US in the last 10 years. I don't do that anymore. I feel like there's a broader recognition. Apologies for the helicopters. I'm in LA. With everything that entails. So we've seen an increase of kind of knowledge and acknowledgement of what's happening. And so I'll just say there's a full-blown attack on trans people, trans rights in the US, and the targeting of trans and queer youth specifically is so extensive that historian Jules Gill Peterson has argued this is the most consolidated attack on queer and trans youth in US history. The marked increase in the introduction of anti-trans bills doesn't originate in the Trump years, not in his first or second term. It actually comes during the Obama presidency, not because President Obama supported these initiatives. It's rather part of a broader conservative strategy. And we can think of anti-trans bills as part of a white Christian nationalist agenda in the US that gained traction in the backlash against Obama, that accelerated under Trump, but wasn't actually initiated by him. And in that sense, if you just think about the fact that the first anti-trans bills we saw during the Obama presidency were focused mostly on bathrooms, that's not an accident. Think about the long white supremacist, ableist, sexist history of managing the space of bathrooms in the US. They're playing on that long history and those fears when they're writing these bills. I want to look with us together at the language of one of these sets of bills that pertains to religious freedom. And this is currently the law in the state of Mississippi. In general, what the religious freedom laws are arguing are that discriminatory acts against queer and trans people should be legal if they're carried out because of a sincerely held religious belief. So that shouldn't be defined as discrimination then. That's practicing religion. So let's look at that language. The opening clauses of this law define what specific religious beliefs are protected. The first two are marriage is or should be recognized as a union of one man and one woman, and sexual relations are properly reserved to such a marriage. So the first two protected religious beliefs are commitment to heterosexual marriage and monogamy, or sex within marriage specifically. So let's notice, first of all, that is or should be, marriage is or should be, which acknowledges that the current political reality does not reflect this, that it should be this. It isn't, but it should be, right? There's a gap between the ideal and the reality that's built into the language. Similarly, that language, sex should be properly reserved to marriage, gestures towards a gap. There's an improper practice of sex that's prevalent, right? In other words, in this part of the law, religious beliefs are counterfactual. They are opposing the reality around them. And that's part of figuring them is a need of protection. These clauses are protecting the belief in a different social order, right? The third clause in the bill functions quite differently. It reads, male, man, or female, woman, refer to an individual's immutable biological sex as objectively determined by anatomy and genetics at time of birth. Okay, so that third clause is protecting the belief that sex and gender are assigned at birth, they can't be changed. There are obvious problems with this. Genetic testing is not standard practice on all newborns, so what is the bill even referring to here? It's also assuming that anatomy and genetics are always going to point the same direction, which many intersex activists have taken issue with. You could notice that male, man, female, woman, that they're collapsing the terms for sex and gender to try and shore up this idea that both sex and gender identity are biological and determined at birth. So there's a lot happening just in that simple sentence, right? But I also want us to pay attention to the other really odd aspect of this clause, which is that the language of anatomy and genetic testing means that we're talking about science and medicine in a bill designed to protect religious belief. In other words, in this law, it's a protected religious belief that medicine establishes sex and gender at birth. From the perspective of the divide between the secular and scientific and religious, which we can take issue with, but that kind of notion that's quite popular, that we see that science and religion are opposed, there's a kind of incoherence. Is it a scientific belief that sex can't be changed? Is it a religious hypothesis that science establishes sex? So we can see reflected in this confused language some of the way that trans bodies are being used to stage a debate over epistemology in this country. How do we know things? And over expertise. Whose expertise matters, right? Even as scholars in religious studies have argued that secularism in the US is not secular in the way that we think, it doesn't function in the ways we think, this invocation of secular science and medicine in a religious freedom bill is startling. The effect, however, is clear. When the law entwines science and theology, it's naturalizing a divinely ordained gender binary. In other words, science and religion do not believe in transsexuals. In consequence, as the rest of it describes, discrimination, refusing services, housing, etc., is transformed. It's not discrimination, it's the enactment of a protected religious belief that trans people are an impossibility. It manifests into reality a religious gender binary. I want to point out one other small detail about the difference between the first two clauses and the last clause, right? I said that the marriage is or should be clause, it's counterfactual. Gay marriage should not exist. It does, but it should not exist according to this law. The trans clause is not counterfactual. Trans people do not exist. The distance between should not exist and do not exist is on some level infinitesimal, and at the same time, it is vast. And here we might think of activist and actress Laverne Cox's statement that trans women of color are told don't exist. Here we see some of the legal foundation of that, right? I want to come back to this difference of should not exist and do not exist when we discuss trans history at the end, if we have time. So what does the secular law in Mississippi have to do with the creation story in Genesis? Despite the fact that the language never explicitly mentions Genesis, this definition of sex is in fact theological. Mother Jones wrote an investigative report proving that the legal language originates with an organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a Christian evangelical legal advocacy organization. You can find an earlier version of this language in a proposed school policy on bathrooms that the ADF distributed to school boards across the country and said, basically, adopt this policy. If you're sued, we'll defend you pro bono. So they're one of the organizations helping to write a particular white Christian, white nationalist, evangelical theology into these laws. When we look at the statement of faith of the ADF, and we don't have time to fully unpack this, so you'll have to trust me. You can look it up if you so desire. You can see the explicit citation of Genesis 1:27, right? That verse that reads, and God created the human in the divine image, creating the Adam in the image of God, creating them male and female. The ADF is interpreting that verse to argue that binary sex and gender is ordained by God in the Bible. God created male and female. Those are the only two options. And that gender binary is part of the order of creation. So any opposition to it is going, in essence, against God's will. Hence, right, trans people do not exist. This is precisely the exact same verse the rabbis are invoking in other contexts to imagine the creation of an androgyne. What person is both male and female at the same time, they ask. That must be the androgyne. Therefore, Adam is an androgyne. So the very same verse the rabbis used to argue the first human is an androgyne is the same verse used by the ADF to imagine the impossibility of transness. My point is not that the ADF is interpreting the verse wrong, nor is my point that the rabbis are liberatory. Both of these are positioning sex, gender as central to law in very different contexts. Both are trying to regulate people. My point is much more basic. We are seeing claims that there is a timeless Judeo-Christian investment in a sex-gender binary that goes all the way back to the Hebrew Bible and that points to Genesis as the origin of the idea of a gender binary. These claims are at best simplistic, and at worst, they are deliberately obscuring a long history of debate over what these verses mean. So normally, I would end here with a nod to theories that originate in the field of the history of sexuality. The ending, as I'll explain in a minute, is no longer as satisfying as used to be. So I'll give you the ending that I would say, based on the research that I essentially argue in the book, and then talk a little bit about my dilemma, and then we'll close. So here's how I normally would end. We live in a time and place that's fighting to impose the idea that gender and sex are binary through law, through our bureaucracies, through our educational systems. One of the pleasures of studying rabbinic sources, then, for me, is that those concepts, those ways of organizing the world that we take for granted right now, that we've construed as natural, come out of a particular time and place. In other words, if the rabbis organized sex, gender differently, then it cannot be true that sex and gender binary have to be this way. It's the only natural choice. They were not always organized in this way. Therefore, they may not always have to be organized this way in the future. It's a nice ending. It's a nod towards hope at the end of a talk that in this iteration is still about really regulation of sex gender. And I still believe in it, but I'm wrestling with the question these days about what the work of trans history accomplishes. So I'll just say a few sentences here because I'm almost out of time. Here's my dilemma. When I talk to friendly audiences, most of you are already fairly convicted that this particular version of the world, this way of organizing sex gender, is not the only way it can work. Most of you are already probably invested in changing it. So to the trans activists and allies, I'm not saying anything new, although it still might be comforting. My hope is it still might bring some comfort in difficult times. At the same time, I'm never going to convince white nationalists that there are other ways to interpret that verse. They're not going to care how the rabbis interpreted Genesis and what that might mean for trans folks today. So I'm struggling with this idea of creating a usable past. And this is a kind of work that a lot of queer and trans historians have done to think about what kinds of usable pasts can we work on to as tools for the present moment, right? Although queer historians don't originate the phrase usable past, I just started looking into it. It actually has quite problematic origins. Ask me about it if you're interested later. So we see, for example, a kind of argument in the face of the current eugenic messages to trans people don't exist, that trans people have always existed in history. In other words, a kind of usable past to counter the current political narratives. That's not exactly what I'm arguing, but my book is saying that there's a particular form of the gender binary that's not timeless, nor a Judeo-Christian construct. So that book, I'm similarly motivated by trying to create a usable history. But that model and that history of sexuality model more generally was created in a different political moment. We're in the midst of a push towards the eugenics of knowledge production and transmission. And you can think about all the regulations about what can be taught about race, gender, disability, and sexuality in schools as part of that move. They're telling us we don't exist, and we are arguing back. But I don't know that that's the conversation I want to be participating in to begin with. I do not need history to tell me that I exist. And while some Jews would definitely disagree with me, and I want them to have the work that helps them as well, I also personally do not need the rabbis or the Bible to tell me that I exist either. In the face of the current eugenic push in the US, of which the regulation of trans people is just one facet, I keep coming back to this question of what is the work of trans history now? Some of this work might be usable history because many trans people still find it uplifting and meaningful, and it is in fact useful. Jules Gill-Peterson and other historians, Caden, contributed to the amicus brief for the recent Supreme Court case on trans medicine, for example, literally usable history, right? But I've begun to wonder about alternative models for thinking about the project of history in this moment. I've begun to wonder about what a non-compliant history might mean rather than a usable history. Can we create history that is obstructive and willful? How can we create history that refuses the terms of the debate? And how must all of our work change to meet this current moment? And maybe you will have some answers for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strassfeld. I know I speak for the community. We're very deeply grateful for your wisdom and your insight and the very important questions that you're asking. We want to take some time now to allow members of the community to ask you some questions. So you have two ways you can do this. Oh, I suppose I should start by saying, hi, I'm Rachel Mikva. I am the Herman Schallman Professor in Jewish Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary, as well as the Senior Faculty Fellow for our Interreligious Institute. And I have the privilege of emceeing the Q&A. So we have about 25 minutes for this if we have that many questions. And if you have a question, you can type it into the chat. If you would prefer to speak it, I would ask that you use the raise hand feature, and you will pop up into the upper left-hand corner of my screen, and I will see that you have a question. While you are all thinking of your questions, I have one that's going to take me a while to get out. You should not follow my model. Your questions should be simple, straightforward. Don't give a talk, but let's see if I can make this question make sense. Your important questions about what is the use of a useful history at this point in our society made me think about the problematic nature of another substantial religious difference that plays out on the political stage between Jewish interpretation and conservative Christian interpretation, and that being around when does life begin and the politics of abortion. That issue plays out again unfruitfully often on counter-religious freedom claims, right? That essentially conservative Christianity is being established, an unacknowledged establishment of religion, which would be a better platform on which to argue the case, but that doesn't seem to be legally possible to argue the case on those terms. Instead, we have to argue it on our religious freedom, which is problematic. Why? I'm not saying you should, but I'd love to hear you expand upon why we wouldn't imagine a counter-religious freedom kind of claim in this instance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a great question. I'm just typing so that I remember all the pieces. Sorry. I would point first to two books, because there's really great scholarship on the question of religious freedom laws and the way that they've worked historically in the US. There's Love the Sin by Anne Pellegrini and Janet Jacobson that examines the sodomy cases and a variety of Supreme Court cases on gay rights issues. And they make the argument that we see the Supreme Court justices using phrases like a timeless morality, right? Which are basically code for Christianity. They're ethicists also. So they also say, basically, if secularism is just a particular form of unmarked white Protestantism, like particular subset of Protestantism, if that's what secularism in the US actually is, then the idea that we have to get religion out of politics, we need to be more secular, is designed to fail, right? Because that is just going to bring us more unmarked, narrow forms of Protestant interpretation. So they say we need more religion in the public sphere, right? Which is not dissimilar to that, that kind of counter-religious claim, right? We see Rachel Cranston, her research talks about how there were suits by Jews pre-Roe v. Wade that said, because of religious freedom, I should have access to abortion, right? And we could imagine similar lawsuits happening in the US around trans and queer rights, right? These kind of countersuits. What we also know from scholars like Pellegrini and Jacobson and Michael McNally, who works on indigenous religious law, is that the closer your religious tradition is towards that kind of unmarked Protestantism, the more likely your court case is to be successful within the US court systems. In other words, indigenous claims towards religious freedom and free practice of religion in this country almost always have been unsuccessful in US courts. And you can see specifically around indigenous folks claiming access to lands that you'll see justices say back, you can believe whatever you want, go believe it somewhere else, right? It's a definition of religion that excludes their connection to sacred lands at an inherent level that mean that it's quite difficult to really have those cases heard successfully. So the better your religious tradition can impersonate what they're thinking of as religion, which is implicitly this very specific form, right? That means you're more successful. Just because it's not possibly going to be a successful legal strategy doesn't mean that we should do it, that we shouldn't do it, right? Right? Like, we should be obstructive in all possible ways. No business as usual in this environment on any level, on any of these issues. Right? And then I just moved to LA 3 weeks ago for my new job. And right, you really see that in not just the mutual aid networks here, which are really incredible and doing amazing work, but you really see the obstructive piece. No business as usual. This is happening. Like, we are not going to allow it. And the city has a long history of really beautiful protest traditions that they're drawing on as part of the resources that LA has to offer to this movement in this moment. So it's possible that that is a tactic we should do, and somebody may be drawing up that lawsuit as we speak. And just because it's probably not going to be successful doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Thank you for the lovely question.
So we have a question in the chat. I'll just read it. I'm curious about the moment in the rabbinic conversation when someone proposes the androgyne to be outside or beyond the law. Are there other moments in those discourses when topics are argued to be similarly outside the law?
That's interesting. There are moments where, like in the Talmud, there are these really quite lovely moments actually, where they'll spend pages and pages arguing back and forth about something. And then they'll say, we don't actually know. Yeah. Like, we're going to allow that disagreement. I mean, you can interpret that in different ways, but in some sense, we're not going to solve that for you. We've now laid out the different arguments, and we're going to allow those contradictions, those different points to stand next to each other. So that's not exactly like this person is outside the law in the same way, but there are other moments where they kind of acknowledge the limits of law in that same way, that law can incorporate everything. Actually, there's some things we don't know. There is a kind of humility in Teku that I like, that's acknowledging there are things that they don't have the answer to. I'm not thinking of another specific parallel case of a person that is rendered in the same way outside of law, but I'll keep thinking about it. It's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, here comes one from Ken Stone. He'd really like to hear more about what you called an obstructive or non-obstructive past as an alternative to usable or useful past. Can you say more about that? And related to that question, you also mentioned in passing that there are some problematic origins for the language of usable past and said we could come back to this. So can you say a little more about that? Especially since usable past is so common in a range of academic and academic adjacent spaces, as you know.
Yeah. Yeah, good. This is me playing, right? So I don't have a good answer yet. There's something about being in LA right now that makes me not want to talk about use and usability. partially also because of the way we can think about use as sort of in a racialized capitalist mode, like the usefulness of things. It can be useful to us, but it means it's also a tool for someone else. Maybe that's not the framework we need in this moment. Although I'm not a pure, I think we need all hands on deck, whatever strategy speaks to you, pursue that strategy. Like, I'm not interested in adjudicating. We need all of them. We need all of these different approaches. So the term usable past, this is very new that I've been playing with this, comes from Van Wyck Brooks in an essay from 1918. In that essay, he's doing a couple of things, but he's basically a literary critic, and he's talking about how he doesn't like how American literary historians are practicing and talking about the past of American literature. We need to create a usable past for American literature so that new work can flourish. So the literary producers of my time, he's saying, need to have a canon, in a sense, to draw on. He doesn't use the word canon, but he's very clearly saying we need some things that are not just to be critiqued, but that we can use. There's some very interesting pieces in this essay where he talks about, everything is in the past, he says. So even if there are pieces to critique, there are other ways to interpret it. There's a kind of mutable quality to the past that I find interesting and intriguing. That's the maybe useful piece of that origin of usable past. But he's also talking about how there needs to be a kind of unified American voice. So there is a nativist quality to this origins, at least, of this idea of a usable past. That's, the essay is very explicitly comparing American literature to European literature. And it's not actively white supremacist, I would say, but implicitly, tacitly, that's, I think, the substructure. Doesn't mean we can't use it, but I do think we need to know the baggage that it comes with. We can reinterpret all we like. Queer historians are meaning different things when they use that term, but I do think it's worth knowing at least that past. So for all these reasons, and for the reason that queer and trans and are not working in the same way right now. So if we think about that law, queer marriage, queer sex should not exist. Trans people do not exist. That there is a kind of ontological battle that trans history is caught in. Like, do we exist or not? That queer history doesn't. So borrowing the methodology of a usable history, a history of sexuality approach, I'm not sure it's equipped to meet this moment. So when I was in Berlin in the fall, I gave this talk and I said, no, I'm really asking, what is the role of trans history now? I don't know. There's a bunch of historians in this room, like, please tell me what we're doing. I don't know what I'm doing in this moment. And Nell Painter, who's an amazing historian focusing on Black US history, said to me, you're building an archive. Right. And that was the only answer that's given me any kind of comfort right now, that we can think of a kind of collection in this moment, maybe even history that I'm not going to live to really see interpreted, but that we are living in historic times, and that part of what we have all become right now is archivists. And so maybe some of the resistance comes in the archive itself and what we're saving and how we're saving it, and how we're building our archives for the future, right? Despite what they're trying to repress, right? They're trying to construct a particular historical narrative that is deeply ahistorical and deeply white supremacist and transphobic and all the things. Like, maybe part of the answer is in building an archive. And I've been playing around with a different kind of art practice, So I'm trying to, the answer is I'm trying to play with it because I genuinely feel a conflict about the fact that I don't think our models are going to work for this moment, and I don't know what that means for us moving forward. Anyways, if you have answers, I really do want to hear them.
Doesn't look like you plan to chime in with a response, Dr. Stone. Well, I will mention something from rabbinic tradition, since we're talking about rabbinic tradition. Of course, one of the things about it is that it preserves minority opinions in the text. And then, of course, it asks, why are we preserving these minority opinions? And true to its nature, there are multiple opinions about why we preserve minority opinions. And one of them is, there may come a time when things are different, and these other perspectives and interpretations will actually guide our steps, and right. So one value of the archive is not only historical, but for imagining a different future.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to lift up, oh no, here's another question. I'm only filling in blanks. I got lots of questions, but other people's come first. So Phyllis Colvin says, perhaps consider a multi-religious or interfaith approach to constructing trans history. The future seems to me to be interfaith, and we could be looking to hijras in India and Two-Spirit in Native American tradition for inspiration.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there is really great research talking about how this idea of the gender binary is tied to colonialism, is tied to white supremacy and racism, and that much of that research we can find on hijras and Two-Spirit folks is pointing that out, like looking at the genealogy of this concept in ways that I think are quite helpful. And I draw on that work in my research. I am a fan of coalition building in general. And I also think it's important at the same time to try and balance the fact that all of these different categories come within their own religious and cultural contexts, and to be careful about the specificity of them. So that's always my dilemma, or what I'm weighing as I'm thinking about how to draw on these other traditions, that I don't want to be part of the colonial move to, pluck religious traditions out of their contexts, which is not what you're saying at all, but that is one possible, effect of this kind of work, right? That it can take these practices out of their contexts and to really draw on the work of scholars that are doing that research. So I agree that I don't think you can think about work in trans studies and religion without reading some of that work, that decolonial work, without reading some of that work on hijras and Two-Spirit folks, because it's so foundational in how we're understanding the construction of the gender binary. And I find it myself really useful and elucidating. And what that means in terms of coalition building or multi-religious interfaith approaches, in not just in the academy, but in the real world, like those coalitions are always challenging and often very worthwhile, right? To think through how to build those coalitions well so that everybody really can participate and bring the specificity of their traditions into the conversation. Thank you for the question.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
And I was going to respond to you, about the minority opinions. I don't know if this is at all a note of hopefulness in what is probably a pretty depressing conversation, but the thing about the Rabbi Yossi coda, that exclusionary tactic. So when we're trying to figure out who won a debate in rabbinics, usually the anonymous opinion is the one that wins. So that's the first opinion, that list. So seems like maybe the list one. or the person who goes last is the one we think of as winning. So here we have the anonymous opinion first. Usually we think that one. And then the disagreeing opinion underneath. Often we think the person who gets the last word, maybe they won the debate, if we can think about winning, right? So it's not clear to me from this text who won. And even if we accept Rabbi Yossi's opinion that androgynes should be excluded, we find that in every layer of rabbinic literature that comes after this source, there are androgynes at the heart of many, many discussions about gender. Androgynes and eunuchs, they're not just like a dozen mentions in this corpus. There are prolific amounts of texts in the rabbinic corpus about these categories. So even if he was intending a gesture of exclusion, all that means is baked into the layers of these sources, we now have this inherited debate that is getting worked out in all sorts of different ways. You can think then of the androgyne as the ghost that haunts the text if you want, or just that you can't ever properly expel something from rabbinic literature because of the way it preserves minority opinions. That gesture never really fully works.
I want to lift up the work of a recent PhD graduate, Zainab Shahar, who's currently at MSU Denver, who quoted you a lot, read your stuff and quoted you a lot. They wrote a dissertation called Insurgent Assemblies, Gender, Ritual Obligation, and Public Religious Space, looking at both halakha, Jewish practice, and Islamic practice, fiqh. So they help me I usually look at the Mishnah version of the passage that you brought from Bikurim. And I teach it, I share it with students because I love it. And I don't necessarily see the individual opinion as disagreeing completely, right? But as saying, don't try to force this unique individual into these structures that weren't made for them, right? They aren't male and female or not all, or both or neither. They are their own creatures, so don't force them into this box. And so it's not use the language of exclusion. It's not excluding them from the law, but trying to give them a place within the system that doesn't force their place in the system. But I'm also really interested in the specifics that the rabbis give, especially for the ways in which they are like men and women. So I don't know what the Tosefta has, but the way that I tend to look at that text, that part of the text, is they say, and this goes to your comment, which I think is an important insight. Rabbinic tradition doesn't usually talk in the language of rights, it talks in the language of responsibilities. These are the things you can't do to this person because they're a human being. Right? So I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how rights become responsibilities and a little of the details of the collective opinion.
Yeah, and if you or somebody has the work or page of the person who just graduated and wants to put it in the chat so we can all check out their work, that would be fantastic. Okay, sorry, there's a dog barking. I'm in my apartment. It's chaotic. Apologies. So sorry, the chaos made me lose the question. I apologize.
If you could talk a little bit about the relationship between rights and responsibilities, as that would then apply to our context in thinking about it now. And then also, if there's time, a little bit about the details of that text.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the words in the text, like I've had other trans and intersex activists talk about the translation with me, and I am all in favor of reinterpreting in any. I am so sorry. The manager of my apartment just showed up, so I need to make sure it's not an emergency. I will be right back. I apologize.
Okay. After this answer, we will close. Dr. Braxton, would you send us off when we come to that moment? I'm sorry I stole all the question space. I mean, if you put your hand up or you put something in the chat, I would have made room for it. But Max and I could probably talk all night. Are you
Okay,
safe?
not an emergency. My building isn't burning down. That's
Oh,
great.
good.
My apartment is safe. Okay, apologies. Yeah, so what I would used to say, so I'll give you an example of the rights versus obligations thing if we have time. Yeah. What I used to say to my kid when they would come home, my kid is non-binary, but they were, before they came out as non-binary, they were identifying themselves as male. So they would go to school, and the boys in their class, when they were in second grade, were required to wear a head covering, and the girls could choose. And they would come home and say to me, it's not fair that they get the opportunity to choose and I am forced to wear it, right? They're in a rights-based US system where they understand choice to be the liberatory, mode, and being forced to wear something, that's the imposition, that's the oppressiveness of law. Which is not to say that law can't be oppressive sometimes, but in the rabbinic mindset, being obligated to do something, being forced to do something, that's a good thing. And the apologists in the Middle Ages that said women are holier and therefore they don't need to be forced to do all these things, right? That is a kind of after the fact gender apologist approach that's trying to justify women's exclusion, right? And it's a kind of encapsulation of that disjoint between how we tend to conceptualize law in the US and what the rabbis mean by halakha, which is something altogether different. The text itself talks about how the androgyne is like both men and women. And it talks about how if you injure the androgyne, the Tosefta version also, similar to the Mishnah. It's not clear whether it belongs in the Tosefta or the Mishnah. There's a huge debate. Lieberman's Tosefta Kifshuta has a whole thing about it. But regardless, both of them have this section about if you harm the androgyne, you're liable just as if you'd harmed any other human being. The closest we come to rights in a non-rights-based system, right? This is an obligation. It's framed, because it's rabbinic literature, it's framed as an obligation on the person doing the harm, right? But the base framework is androgynes are human beings like men and women are, and if you do something wrong to them, you are obligated to make that right. And I think there's different ways to understand that. The hopeful way is to say they are affirming the humanity of the androgyne, right? That there is this base similar to I think Bria is a reference to creation. Like they understand the androgyne as a human, as created by God. There's no denying that. With the eunuch too, we say eunuchs are, we see some play of words and some rabbinic texts that talk about eunuchs created by the hand of heaven. I mean, it's explicit in the literature. Those people are born eunuchs are created by the hand of heaven. So we see that kind of hopeful strain. There is another way to read it, and I'm not invested in how anyone reads it, which is, why is the humanity of the androgyne reinforced through their harm or death? Why is this a question we have to say? Why is the human spoken about through the frameworks of male and female? And I think both are true. Just as I think unique creation, which is why so many trans and queer and intersex Jews are drawn to that last line by Rabbi Yossi, means something beyond a gender binary. That's why folks are turning to that line. I still also believe there is a move of exclusion, and there's many ways to interpret that last line, but both are present, right, in that line.
Dialectic to the end. Thank you so much for all the talk and all of your really thoughtful and insightful answers. And we're very grateful for the work that you're doing and for that which you shared with us this evening. Dr. Braxton, let's give you the last word.
Thank you, Dr. Mikva. Dr. Strassfeld, you have taught us with precision, passion, and compassion. Through your profound efforts in transing the Talmud, you have illuminated not merely a concept, but a living process, a sacred act of assembling and reassembling bodies, ideas, and traditions. We have brought together our diverse bodies this evening, eager to break down divisive binaries and to fluidly and playfully, I was listening to you with my third ear, playfully flow across boundaries. In this sacred gathering, empowered by myriad traditions, we are realizing anew that we are all beloved children of our divine parent, whose love is as capacious as the universe itself. As we depart, may we carry this expansive vision forth, continuing to trans our communities, our scholarship, and our very lives, so that justice, peace, and radically inclusive love might flourish in every part of our world. We are grateful to one and all for a truly inspiring gathering. And let's keep transing and disrupting, because it cannot be business as usual.